My name's Diane Coyle. I'm a professor here in the economics department. I know some of you, but not all of you, of course. Welcome to tonight's debate about whether the rich are paying their fair share of taxes. This is the first in a series of events being run by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, supported by the Economic and Social Research Council. IFS is an independent, politically impartial research institute. You'll have heard its spokespeople on the news a lot, I think. And they've been operating for 50 years with the aim of informing public debate on economics and helping the development of good economic policies. So this is part of the debate, and we're going to hear from Helen Miller today, who is an associate director and runs the tax sector at IFS. And Helen will speak for about half an hour, and then it's over to you. So you've got half an hour listening to her, thinking about what comments and questions you're going to ask afterwards. So save them for later. And Helen, thank you very much.
I would like you all to imagine it's 1966 and you're this guy. He's George. George grew up in a council estate in the north of England. His dad was a bus conductor, his mum was a shop assistant, and George was a bright kid who worked really hard, did well at school, and got rich. What's a fair tax rate for George? Specifically, imagine that both George and his dad get a pay rise of £100. Remember, George's dad is a bus conductor. He's on a relatively low income. So let's say he pays £20 in tax. How much of that £100 should George pay to ensure that he's making his fair contribution? Now, I'm not going to get you all to reveal your numbers, but I'm pretty sure if I did, you'd all have different numbers in mind for what George's tax rate should be. And that's because there's loads of different concepts of what's fair. So you'll all be using different criteria. I suspect that most of you will think that fairness requires the rich pay more, but that leaves plenty of room for disagreement about how much more income tax a rich person should pay. Some of you might be thinking about measures of ability to pay that aren't just linked to income. Some of you might be thinking about broader definitions of contributions to society, and lots more things besides. So I'm pretty sure you'll have different numbers in mind. But hopefully now you have your numbers for what George's tax rate should be. So let's go back to 1966. And that year, this man was Prime Minister. He's Harold. And the top rate of income tax in the UK was 95%. Now, that wasn't the rate that applied to all earnings. It was the marginal tax rate that kicked in once your earnings were above a certain level, effectively the rate you start to paying once you're a high earner. But it did mean that if George earned that extra £100, he'd get to keep a fiver. So is 95% a fair tax rate? And what about 98%, which is what the rate would rise to in the 1970s? I can't answer that question for you. It's not the role of economics or of an economist to say what is and what isn't fair. Some of you will think 95% is fair, some of you won't. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder. What I can tell you is that George was not a fan of 95% tax rates. I know that because he wrote a song about it. What I didn't tell you about George was that he was the lead guitarist of a band called the Beatles, who in the 1960s were the most famous band in the world. George wasn't just a little bit rich, George was one of the highest earners in the country. Now, some of you will have already known or guessed who George was. But for those of you who didn't, the reason I asked you to make a judgment about George's tax rate before I told you who he was because I know that our sense of fairness can differ quite a lot depending on who we have in mind. So when I said that fairness is in the eye of the beholder, I don't just mean that we all have different concepts of fairness. I also mean that our own concepts of fairness differ depending on who we're imagining. So is your stereotypical rich person a hard-working kid from a council estate who through some talent and luck hit the big time? Or are you more likely to imagine a ruthless business tycoon who clawed their way to the top? Because whoever it is you're imagining when you think of a rich person, it's probably going to affect what you think about their fair share of tax, which is perfectly natural, right? We're all social creatures. It's understanding that we think that way. But it makes tax fairness a kind of slippery concept. How do we turn these judgments about specific types of people into hard policy that sets tax rates for all high earners? And here's another thing that makes tax fairness a slippery concept. When you ask people in polls or in surveys what they think about tax, whether they think it's fair or not, most people will state a pretty strong opinion. But we know that those opinions are actually remarkably easy to manipulate. And that's not just true of people in surveys, it's true of all of us. So before coming here tonight, I ran a little survey. And many of you took part, so thank you very much. And you answered this simple question. Broadly, do you think the UK tax system is fair? So here's what I found. About 22% of you said don't know. About 16% said yes, the tax system is fair. About 11% said, no, it's not fair because the rich pay too much. And then the rest of you, about half of you, said, no, it's not fair because the rich don't pay enough. Now, this is quite interesting. It suggests that most people, in this little poll at least, aren't happy with the system. But this is not what I was interested in. It's not why I set up the poll. What I was actually interested in is how our stated opinions differ depending on the information we have access to. So what you didn't know was that before answering this question, you were randomised into one of three groups. One group of you just got the question, and they're the results I'm showing you here. The other two groups got some information before answering the questions, and check out what that does to the results. So I just showed you that in the group that got no information, 51% of people think the tax system is unfair. Now in the second group, which I'm going to call the rich pay a lot group, they got two statistics, both true, which emphasise that a lot of people in the UK don't pay income tax at all, and the rich pay quite a lot. In that group, the proportion of people who said the tax system was unfair fell to 33%. The way to see that is that a fifth of people had their minds changed by those two statistics. In the third group, which I'm going to call the rich don't pay a lot group, people saw two different statistics, and this time they emphasised that income inequality is high, and they told you that somebody earning £45,000 and £145,000 faced the same marginal tax rate. In this group, the proportion of people who think the tax system is unfair jumps to 72%. Now, I'm not presenting these as hard science. These are just a little straw poll that I did for some fun. But these are pretty big changes. If you look at the difference between group 2 and 3, the number of people who said the tax system was unfair more than doubled on the back of two statistics. The lesson here is not that statistics can't be trusted. Statistics are awesome, and they can teach us all sorts of wonderful things about how the world works. And I didn't just set up this poll to show you that we should be careful when we see statistics out of context, although we all know we should be careful because we know that statistics can back up our prejudices, and we know that cherry-picking statistics to support a cause is a tried and tested technique. I think the broader lesson of both this little poll and of the story about George is that tax fairness is a complex issue. What we say we think is fair is going to depend on who we have in mind and the information we have at our fingertips. It's hard to get a grip on what's fair. And this is where I think economics can help. I already said I can't tell you what you should think of as fair, and I certainly didn't come here tonight to change anybody's mind. But I think what economics can do is help us unpack the various issues I've just been touching on and put them in their proper context. Perhaps most importantly, it can help us turn these judgments about what's fair into hard policy. So what I'm going to do is give you my top 3 tips from economics, which will hopefully help you as you make your judgments about whether our system is fair, and hopefully help you navigate the various tricky issues that are going to come up. So tip 1, know who's currently paying tax. If we're going to start making judgments about whether people are paying their fair share, it's a pretty good idea to start with just taking stock of what the current system looks like. So in thinking particularly about rich people, I told you that top tax rates, income tax rates, were high in the 60s and 70s. Today, the top rate of tax in the UK is 45%, so it's more than halved in the last 50 years. But what does that mean about how much tax rich people are paying? Well, to start to answer that question, I want you to imagine we're in a room with 100 people, and we're going to imagine that these 100 people represent the UK economy, the UK population. I'm going to line these people up from poorest over on the left to richest on the right, and I'm going to imagine how the total amount of income tax revenue the government raises, which is about £175 billion this year, is raised from these different types of people. Now, if everyone paid the same share, this is how the graph would look. This is not how the graph actually looks in reality. Instead, if I'm walking along this line from the poorest person to the richest person, I'll have to get to the 40th person before I find anybody who's paying any income tax. 4 in 10 adults in the UK don't pay income tax. That's either because they're students, they could be unemployed, or they could be working or getting a pension, but not having an income that's high enough to mean that they start paying income tax. But now we're in this room, we have 60 people left, still no income tax revenue. If I take the next 30 of those people, we see that that group are paying 10% of the income tax. If I take the next 24 of those people, that group are paying 30%, and that means that the remaining 60% is coming from the 6 richest people in the room. And in fact, if I go right to the richest person in that line, the richest single individual is paying the equivalent of 25% of all income tax. This is a pretty top-heavy system. But one of the reasons we raise a lot from the top is because that's where a lot of the income is. The richest person in this room has the equivalent of 12% of the income. So even if we had a proportional tax that raised the same share of everyone's income, we'd expect the rich to be paying more. In fact, we have a progressive income tax system, which means that we take higher taxes as a share of income from higher earners than from lower earners. And that's what's creating part of this large tax at the top. But now you might think that given that I just told you that top taxes have come down in the last 50 years, that the amount being paid by the top is falling. In fact, the opposite is true. The amount of income tax revenues we raise from the highest earners has been increasing over time. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the amount of income going to the top has been increasing. Income inequality is going up, at least over decades. The second thing is that in recent years, governments have chosen to raise more income tax revenues from the top, but to do so in ways that don't require putting up the top marginal tax rates. So it's been a policy choice to get more revenue from the top. So now you know where income tax revenue is coming from, but what does that mean for how much tax the rich are paying? Well, of course, the answer to that depends on who you think is rich. To get into the top 1% club, you need to have an income of £162,000. I suspect by most people's definitions, that makes you rich. But what about somebody who's in the top 10% of income taxpayers? To get into that club, you need an income of just over £50,000. Now, at that point, you have more income than 90% of the population. You are earning over double somebody in the middle of the room. So on plenty of definitions, you're rich too. But you might not feel rich. And that could have to do with your circumstances. If you're on that income, but you have a couple of kids and a house, you may feel less well off than a single person on a lower income. But it's also probably got quite a lot to do with who you're comparing yourself to. In my example, you're one of the richest 6 people in the room. But the richest person in the room still earns £110,000 more than you do. Now, there are lots of different definitions of who's rich, but there's one that I heard recently that's kind of stuck in my mind. And I heard it from the chief executive of the polling company, Ipsos Mori. They're a company that asks people how they feel and think about lots of different things. And he said, if you want to generalise, then people think that wealthy people are people earning about £10,000 more a year than they are. Now, of course, I think we can all understand why we could all vote for taxes on the rich if what's happening is we're looking at our neighbours and defining the rich as somebody else. The serious point here is that if we want to start thinking about how much tax rich people should pay, we have to get specific about who are the rich, who are we talking about. If by rich we're only talking about the top 1% of income taxpayers, then that group currently has 12% of the income, they pay 25% of the income tax, and that means that regardless of how you feel about people in that group, we're fairly reliant on them for our revenues. If we want to get more from them, we could put up their tax rates, but it is a relatively small group, so there's a limit to how much money we could get there. If by rich you mean other groups, then we have to specify which ones. So now you know more about income tax, it's time for tech 2. Don't get hung up on any one part of the system. The tax system is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a system. I just spent all that time drawing your attention to income tax, and that's an important one. It's our single biggest revenue raiser. It's what the government uses to drag in about a quarter of the revenue overall. And it's the tax we use to create a progressive tax system. But if you're trying to think about fairness, you can see that it's clearly only the tip of the iceberg. We know that there are lots of other taxes, including taxes on much of the stuff we buy, there are taxes on, like council tax on the places we live, there are business taxes, and a whole host of others. And these taxes all have different properties. And that's one of the reasons that people don't think that all taxes are equally fair. Now, that won't be surprising given what I said earlier about tax fairness being in the eye of the beholder. But I think what might surprise you is which taxes people say they like and don't like. So a couple of years ago, YouGov did a poll where they showed people a list of taxes and said, can you tell us whether you think these taxes are fair or unfair? And to give you a sense of scale, about 50% of people in this poll said that income tax was fair. The most hated tax was a tax that 60% of people said was not fair. What do you think it is? I'll give you a clue. Most people will never pay it, and it's hated by Labour and Conservative voters alike. The answer is inheritance tax. And the reason that's surprising is because inheritance tax is a progressive tax, meaning it's higher as a share of incomes for better off people than for less well-off people. It's actually one of our most progressive taxes. Only 4% of people expect to leave an inheritance tax bill when they die, and most of the money is paid, most of the revenue is got from millionaires. People don't like it. And if that isn't surprising enough, check out what the most popular tax is. This is one that 70% of people think is fair, and this actually wins a top spot by a fair margin. In this case, the answer is cigarette taxes. And the reason that's one surprising is that this is a tax that hits the poorest hardest. It's regressive, meaning it's higher as a share of income for poor people than for rich people. So what's going on? People are saying that they don't like taxes on millionaires, but they're big fans of taxes that hit poorest people hardest. Of course, the answer is that there's all sorts of things that are going on in driving these judgments. For example, one thing that might be happening is that people think of smoking as an undesirable behaviour and as bequeathing inheritances to your kids as a desirable behaviour, and that might help shape some of those judgments. But whatever it is that's driving these things, I think that what this poll shows is that people don't necessarily care if any one part of the system is progressive or regressive. And probably the reason is because we know there's lots going on. We're probably comfortable with cigarette taxes in part because we know that there are other ways that we raise money from the rich and there are other ways that we help the poor. So most people understand my tip too, that it's the system that matters, even if they hadn't realised it. And hopefully now you're all convinced that it's the system that matters and we shouldn't get hung up on any one tax. So given that, I'm going to try to give you a high-level overview of what our system looks like and sort of unpack some of this iceberg. I'm going to try to do that by showing you 5 example people with 5 different levels of income and think about how the system affects how well off they are. So let's start with taxes, and here I'm going to show you not just income tax, but also national insurance contributions, which is a tax on income, just like income tax, and council tax. Since all my example people need somewhere to live. What you can instantly see here is that the rich are paying higher taxes. In my particular example, my richest guy is paying the equivalent of 42% of his income in these 3 taxes. My well-to-do Sue has an effective average tax rate here of 32%, and Mark has a tax rate on these 3 taxes at least of 17%. And this is really a reflection of our progressive income tax system. We take more from higher earners. But if I now show you my 2 people who aren't working, they're also paying council tax. And at first blush, that might feel pretty troubling because they have no earnings from work, yet they're paying taxes. But of course, the government doesn't just raise tax. It also gives people benefits. And if I pop those on the chart, you can see that they can be pretty important. So unemployed Annie here is getting help with her council tax bill, and she's getting some unemployment benefits. And my penny pensioner is getting a government pension. So what really matters for how much money these guys have in their pockets at the end of the day is both the tax and the benefit system. Now, of course, once these people go out to the shops and they buy stuff, they'll be paying more tax. And exactly how much they pay depends on how much they spend and what they spend it on. So, for example, if Annie is a hard smoker, she's going to be spending quite a lot on cigarette duties. But again, the overall point here is that if we're thinking about how fair or progressive the tax system is, it's not enough just to think about any one tax or about how much income tax the rich pay. It's not even enough to think about all taxes. What we want to be thinking about is taxes and what the government spends it on benefits. And in fact, the government doesn't just spend money on benefits. It also spends lots of money on schools, roads, hospital, parks, and lots more of that kind of good stuff. And we all benefit from that. But some people benefit particularly from those kinds of services, and they can be particularly important for fairness in thinking about creating an equality of opportunity. So we need to think about taxes and benefits and government spending, but even that's not quite enough to get really a full sense of the shape of our system. And that's because what I'm doing here is showing you people a snapshot in time. But we all know that people's changed loads over their lifetimes. Take Annie. She's poor today. Let's imagine tomorrow she gets her first job, say in a science lab. Now she looks better off. Then check out what happens if I get Annie a boyfriend and a couple of kids. Now she looks quite a bit better off because now she's getting higher benefits. And then let's imagine that in 20 years' time we check in with Annie and we find out that she's running the science lab. Now she looks a lot more like well-to-do Sue. And then, after this rather eventful working life, and what I think you have to agree is a remarkable lack of any signs of visible ageing, we check in with Annie, and she's now a pensioner, and she's back to having no income from work. It can be misleading to look at people at any snapshot in their lives. We care about people who are poor today, and some people will be poor in all periods. And for that reason, we care about the kind of social security safety net we have in our system. But plenty of people who are poor today won't be poor in all periods. So we have to take that into account in thinking about how the system works. And once we're thinking about these lifetime effects, it's really easy to see that the government isn't just taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Actually, quite a lot of what the government is doing is redistributing within people at different points in their lives. One way to think about this is that most of us will pay taxes during our working lives, and effectively we're paying for the government services and benefits, many of which we'll use more when we're young and when we're old. So that's a kind of a high-level overview of our system and all its glorious moving parts. But I'm clearly just showing you 5 example people. And clearly, not everyone is going to look like this. I mean, for example, very many pensioners have their own private pensions incomes, and they're going to look a lot better off than my penny pensioner. And of course, exactly how much tax and benefit somebody gets is going to depend on their circumstances. But we can do this kind of exercise for all people, thinking about those circumstances and different taxes, and getting an overall shape of the system. Now, that kind of exercise throws up lots of numbers. What I'm going to do here is just show you 3 to highlight the system. And here, there are no more tricks. Here I'm picking statistics, not to try to sway your opinion, but to try to give you a sense of what this system we have actually looks like. So statistic number 1, the top 10% of households, based on income, pay 30% of all tax. And in fact, that's probably a bit of an underestimate, because there are some taxes that we know are paid by better off people, but that we find hard to attribute to households. But what it's giving you a sense of is basically how much income, how much tax we raise from the top. You'll notice, or some of you might notice, that this is less top-heavy than income tax, which is one of the reasons why we don't just want to focus on any one tax. That's about where we get the money from. If we now think about taxes and benefits together, then we see that the system as a whole works to increase the income of the poorest 10% of households by 27%, and to decrease the income of the top 10% by 33%. That's getting a measure of some kind of level of redistribution, and again, it's showing you that both taxes and benefits are important for what the government's doing. But then if we look at lifetimes, we see that about 60% of the redistribution that the government does is across periods of life. So it's definitely not all about taking from the rich and giving to the poor. So the punchline for my tip 2 is that it's perfectly fine to think about one bit of the system, like income tax for the rich. But if we want to start making judgments about fairness, we probably need to realise that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's always loads more interesting and important stuff just beneath the surface. And if we want to think about fairness, we should think about all of that stuff and about how people are treated as they move through their lifetimes. But now you have my top 2 tips. Know who's currently paying tax, and remember that system's a system. But what if after all of this you decide that you've seen that and you want the rich to pay more? It might be tempting that you just need to think that you just need to decide who the rich are and pop up their income tax rates. And you can do that. But this is where my tip 3 comes in. Remember, people respond to taxes. Now, I suspect this sounds thoroughly mundane, but I think it's my most important tip. I just talked about the tax and benefit system as something that happened to people as they move through their lives. But we know that people know about taxes and benefits, and they affect the choices that they make, including how and how much to work. And we can understand what all this means about how we get money out of rich people by thinking about pie. When we're thinking about redistribution, about how to take from the rich and give to the poor, we're thinking about how to share out the economic pie. And that's really important, obviously. What we also want to think about is how big the pie is in the first place. And a big pie that's fairly shared out sounds great, right? Here's the rub. How we share out the pie can directly affect the size of the pie. Now, that's not always true. Some level of redistribution is good for the size of the pie. For example, a sense of fairness is important for social cohesion, and that in turn is absolutely necessary for a well-functioning economy. But usually, when we're thinking about policy reforms, there's a trade-off between what economists call equity and efficiency. If we want more equity, more fairness, we need to take more pie from rich people. That reduces their incentive to work. If we want more pie, then we need to let people keep more of their resources so they have the incentive to go work and contribute to economic growth, but that makes it harder to fulfil our redistributive goals. So there's a trade-off. And economists spend a lot of time worrying about these kinds of things, and a lot of time digging around in data, trying to work out how particular types of people respond to particular types of tax. And we're not doing this just because we only care about efficiency. We also spend lots of time thinking about things like, how do you best help poor people? But we're spending a lot of time looking at how people respond to taxes because we want to be able to design taxes in such a way that people don't radically change their behaviour in response. how people respond to taxes is really important. And it's not just, excuse me, it's not just about how the rich respond. It's not just about how people in work respond. Think of unemployed Annie. When she was thinking about whether to get a job, getting a job means you'll lose your benefits and you'll start paying your tax. In considering whether to take that job or which type of job to take, what you're left with at the end of the day, after tax and benefits, is going to affect that decision. And if all this talk about efficiency just sounds like an exaggerated problem, consider. There are 30 million people in the UK workforce. If even a small proportion of them respond to tax by maybe putting in a little bit less effort, not working quite as hard to get a promotion, maybe not taking on an extra project that could get them a bonus, maybe retiring just a little bit early, all of those seemingly small decisions can add up at the economy-wide level to something that's quite important. What's more, sometimes when we think about responses to taxes, they're not small at all. So to see a particular example of responses to tax, let's go back to George, because I never told you what he did in response to a 95% tax rate other than write a protest song. The answer is that George and his bandmates got an accountant who told them they could avoid those 95% tax rates by setting up a company. So they did. They called it Apple Corps, which apparently Paul McCartney thought was a funny play on words. And it didn't allow them to avoid taxes altogether, but it did allow them to avoid those 95% tax rates. And they weren't the only pop stars doing this kind of thing. Other pop stars were also setting up companies. Some were finding fairly exotic schemes to park their money offshore, and some just left the UK altogether. And what these responses mean is that if the aim of the 95% tax rate was to increase fairness by getting more income out of people like the Beatles, it didn't work. Plenty of rich people still had their cash. They were made worse off, at least to the extent that they had to go to the effort of avoiding the taxes, but those responses weren't good for the rest of us either. There were plenty of pop stars in the 60s and 70s that left the UK and never came back. What that means is that the UK didn't only fail to get the 95% it was trying to get at the time, it's lost the opportunity to raise any income tax from those high earners in any of the decades since. And we can't just solve these problems by closing loopholes. That has a part to play, but it's an absolutely useless approach if people are responding to taxes by genuinely changing their behaviour. I mean, closing loopholes isn't going to stop people moving to California, not unless we're going to start banning the rich from leaving the country. And you might think, well, but closing loopholes must help with this issue about moving into companies. And it's true, actually, this would be a fairly easy problem to fix. The government would need to ensure that people who work for their own companies and took their income in dividends got taxed in the same way as people who just had a normal job. Instead, governments give lower rates to those kinds of people. They choose to give lower rates to people who work for their own companies, and usually they do that because they think it might be good for boosting entrepreneurship or investment. It's not clear that's a good way to target those issues. But either way, the price of that choice is that when you put up income tax rates, people can switch into being companies, working for their own companies. And that's not just of historic interest. That's something that's true in our system today. So we care about how people respond to taxes. And you don't need to care about rich people to care about that. The reason we care is because it affects all of us. For example, if people move outside of the UK, we're not going to be able to get revenue from those people. And this is really what it means to take seriously the trade-off between equity and efficiency. It doesn't mean that we can't put up tax rates on rich people. We could, and we could raise some more money. What it really means is that we should consider whether there are other, better ways to fulfil our redistributive goals without some of the negative consequences that come with some policy changes. So for example, we could think about looking at dividend taxes or how we tax capital gains or housing. And by understanding how people respond to tax and what the different policy options are, we can try to work out the best way to find the balance between the size of the pie and the distribution of the slices. But now I've talked about statistics, icebergs and pie. Let me bring all that together to close. We started with a seemingly simple question. Are the rich paying their fair share of taxes? Now, I already told you that, as an economist, I can't answer the question for you. Each of you will have to make your own judgments. But in making our judgments, I think we'd all benefit from a higher quality public debate about who pays tax, how much we raise, how much everyone's paying, and how we spend it. At the moment, the debates around these kinds of things go something like this. We start with fairly strong gut instincts about whether the rich pay enough or too much. We have those views backed up by some cherry-picked statistics. And then, without really thinking much about who the rich are, how much they're currently paying, what the policy options are, we move very quickly to thinking that they should pay more or less. Now, that probably isn't going to change overnight, but hopefully my top tips will help give you the tools from economics so that you can better engage with these public debates and these important issues, so that when we discuss these important society-wide questions in future, we can have a better debate. I hope that what we can do is find a way to have our pie and eat it. Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much. Who would like to ask the first question? There's a hand right up in the middle here. Yep, you.
There's a microphone coming. One of the areas that you didn't touch upon was on tax relief, and one of the big issues in terms of the rich is the various generous tax relief, particularly on pensions that they have had. I mean, I know that's been tightened up in recent years, but there is, in terms of equity, I think there are major issues about who are benefiting from tax relief.
Thank you. Can you pass it in front of you for the next question? But Helen, take that one first.
Okay, great. So tax relief, yes. But also, it's worth saying there's tons of things I didn't touch on there, and that was a very quick talk. So think of all the things you'd like to ask. There are tons of tax reliefs. They're kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they're not all born equal. So it's hard to talk about tax relief in general without getting into specifics. So just to take the issue about pension relief, some level of pension relief is a good idea. I mean, basically the way to think of pensions is that you earn some income, and we can either tax you today or tax you when you're a pensioner. And part of how the reliefs are working for pensions is ensuring that you don't get taxed twice. And that's a good idea. We want to be doing that. There's also an extent to which we give people kind of a tax break if they do some saving. And there's a debate to be had about how big that tax break should be. As you mentioned, the government has recently changed policies to make at least certain types of pension savings less generous. There are better and worse ways to cap pension saving, but you're right, it will be the case that high earners will benefit from some of those reliefs. But again, the idea is that we shouldn't throw out the whole relief system in principle. We could think about how generous the relief should be and who's benefiting from them. But some degree of relief that says you can save today for a pension is a good idea.
And the next one was in front. People at the back, you're going to have to wave really vigorously so I can see you. But let's take this one next. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Towards the end, you mentioned very briefly the capital gains tax. Now, after your lecture and knowing about the marginal rate of tax on the top income earners, it seems a lot more fair, our current tax system. But knowing that the top 10% only have 30% of the income, and the top 10% have 70% of the wealth, do you think there needs to be any reform on capital tax gains because of the fact that wealth is one of the major creators of the inequality?
Great, so great question. So you're right, wealth is unequally distributed. It's more unequally distributed than income. I think there are kind of two ways to try and think in broad level terms about how you tax wealth. You can tax wealth as it's being created, so as the income is flowing in, or once there's a stock of wealth, you can try and do something about it there. So capital gains is the first of those. It's saying, you have an asset, you get some capital gains, let's tax it, as we go along. Most capital gains actually are to do with houses, and that's a tricky one to try to tax for various reasons. Although people are getting big gains there, and you might worry about unfairness if some people just got lucky and they bought a house years ago and they've got these big untaxed capital gains. There are other anomalies in the capital gains system. So, for example, one of my bugbears is that we have something called entrepreneurs relief, which actually relates to the discussion we were having about companies, which means that some individuals who run their own companies can get access to a very, very low rate of capital gains. Now, again, the argument is to try to boost entrepreneurship. It's a pretty poorly targeted way to do it. I think it does raise issues of fairness because it's saying that some people who get certain kinds of income in certain kinds of ways are getting a lower tax rate because they could take their income in certain ways. So the answer of what we could do about it is we'd need the political will to remove some of the reliefs for entrepreneurs. We could also do things like we currently forgive capital gains at death. So if you get capital gains during your life, then lots of them are taxed. If you die, you get let off. So there are things about the current system we could change to tax capital gains more comprehensively. The question about wealth is a different one because obviously not all wealth comes from capital gains, it comes from other places. And if there are historic gains that haven't been taxed, then starting to tax them in the future isn't going to help with that kind of stock of wealth. But we could change capital gains.
And there's one over here next, and then the gentleman there after that.
When you said that George is paying 95% of his income in taxes, obviously it sounds unjust, but I wondered why didn't you ask the question whether we find it just that pop stars or football stars or investment bankers gain so much money? For me, this is the more important question.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, George has really just an example to kind of get everyone thinking about the issue. I think you're right. You can think about these issues as either taking as given the income people have and then saying, how do we take it off of them and what redistribution do we do through the tax system? Or you can start to think about why these people have income inequality in the first place. Now, with football stars, I think that's kind of an easy one because it's just that people love football. They pay a lot of money to go and see football games and the stars get a lot of money. In other cases, it's, there are lots of different things going on as to why income is accruing at the top. And if we worry about income inequality, we might want to think about why that's happening and why is it that some people get to the top and some people don't. And there's all sorts of research in economics going on that tries to understand those kinds of mechanisms. But you're right, we could think about policies that try to get people better income before we tax them rather than just taking it away from them.
Thank you. Next one? Yeah.
A short while ago we had the empty bedroom tax for council, people living in council houses. Property tax is good in that you can identify, people can't, well they can move their properties out of the country, but it's a bit difficult.
Yeah.
So I've got quite a nice house and I think I'm in the second highest band, but there's people in houses 10 times, 100 times more than mine who don't, it's very regressive, if you like.
Yeah.
The other thing is the empty bedroom tax. One of our biggest problems is homelessness. If we had an empty bedroom tax on private property, people couldn't avoid it, and it could be a hell of a revenue raiser.
Great. So for everyone else in the room, that was a policy suggestion about taxing empty bedrooms, but a broader question there about council tax. So for everyone who's not knowledgeable about council tax, the thing to know about that is that it's a tax that for the place you live. And we have a bizarre situation currently in the UK where the valuation we use to assess council tax is based on 1991 values, which is absurd. You think about how much has changed in that period. It's crazy that we're still producing a system that's based on those out-of-dated values. It's also, as the gentleman correctly said, the case that it's regressive in the sense that people who are in higher, very expensive housing don't pay a lower share of their house value in council tax. So council tax is one where I think there is a very good reason that we should revalue all our houses to bring the values up to date, and we should set it at least proportional to housing value so that those people who are living in very expensive housing are paying more relative to people in lower value housing. Now, I think that would be good from a tax policy point of view. I think politicians are nervous about doing that because people get nervous when you mention taxes on their homes. But I think it is an area of the tax system where it's hard to justify the current system. And we could, think about my size of the pie and distribution of the pie, we could do some things there that would be good for both.
There's one.
The empty bedroom tax.
I'm not sure we want to have an empty bedroom tax on empty bedroom. I mean, I'm not sure how you even define empty bedrooms in, I've got an office, is it a bedroom? I don't know. So I think I might have a problem with putting that in practice. But the idea of people have their housing and they get value from that housing, associating a tax with that in some way is the right thing to do.
At the back, yeah. And then I'm going to look over this side of the room. It's been very quiet so far.
Thank you. Could we unpack tip 3 a little bit more to help us assess fairness by a sense of the estimate of how much tax is avoided or evaded through the international loopholes and transfer of income? Because your statistics, I think, are based on what the rich pay based on declared income or declared capital gains. And we know there's a huge industry of moving this around through shell companies or trust funds to avoid or minimise your tax. that affects my sense of what is fair, to have a sense of that scale of activity and whether indeed it's growing in the global finance tax structures.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a whole bunch of great questions there. So just some technical issues, you're right that what I'm showing you here is based on how much money we actually raise and how people respond. I mean, one thing to just bear in the back of your mind is that, you know, if people respond to a tax in the UK by doing one of these schemes, then it does mean that we're going to get less money from that tax. And before we do that tax, we might want to stop some of those schemes first rather than just picking up the tax and letting it flow out. In terms of estimates, it's a really hard one. I mean, first of all, there's lots of different types of avoidance. So we could be thinking, I mean, pop stars moving to California as a type of avoidance, but that's clearly different to the kinds of shell companies or the more artificial structures that I think you have in mind. We could think about it for the individual level or for the company level, and each of those come with different numbers. And we could think about flows of income or stocks of wealth. So to put some numbers on it, although bearing in mind that there are tons of numbers out there, HMRC put a number on what they call the tax gap. That's basically the amount of money they think they should be able to collect, given current rules, that they fail to collect each year. That's about 6% of total revenues, which is a lot. I mean, it's enough that we would want that money to spend on stuff, but compared to other countries, it's not that we're doing a shockingly bad job of raising our revenues. If you look into those numbers, that's actually not the kinds of things you'll think about shell companies. Actually, a lot of that is things like self-employed people, cash in hand type stuff. It's VAT under declaring and all those kinds of issues. The things that are much, much harder to get a handle on, just because we don't see them, is things like wealth in offshore trusts, for example. So there's an economist called Gabriel Zucman who's done some work on this, and he's probably the best number in town. His estimate is that about 8% of global wealth is held in like these offshore trust type things. But that's very unevenly distributed across countries. So if you look at where a lot of that's coming from, it's coming from Africa, South America, Russia, and in those places, some of it, I mean, the numbers are eye-watering. For places like the UK and the US and other European countries, they're not as big as 8%. So that's one set of issues. And on corporations, I think the tricky thing about corporations when you think about avoidance is to really define what do we mean by avoidance. So the shell companies, I think you have in mind, their problem is just that how do you measure it? We don't have the information. If you think about something like Apple, you know, the iPhone creator Apple, not this Apple. Apple are, you know, creating a lot of technology in the US. But iPhones are created, you know, basically mainly in China, but sucking in components from Japan, Switzerland, France, you know, all over the place. And then they're sold in, say, the UK. So when we're thinking about, you know, are Apple avoiding their taxes? Well, the fundamental question is, where should they have been paying taxes? You know, the way the current tax system is set up says that they should be paying taxes where the value was created. Most of that value for an iPhone was created in the US. It's the technology, it's the ideas, it's the software. So if Apple's paying low taxes in some countries like the UK, it's partly because that's how we choose to tax Apple. Now, Apple are avoiding US taxes, and that's a choice the US is making, but it doesn't mean that we can get the money. So, I mean, I think your question's a very good one, because I think you're right. It does, our sense of fairness, it clearly matters who's avoiding tax. You know, I think the punchline would be everyone's avoiding tax, if you believe the statistics. Everyone, to some extent, is paying a, you know, cash-in-hand plumber. We clearly care about the stuff at the top end, and we don't have great estimates of that. The estimates we do have suggest that it's, you know, it's right at the top end, the very wealthy people. It's not, you know, the average middle-class person who's doing it. And the numbers are fairly big.
So I know there's
very long answer.
There's another couple of questions at the back here. I'm looking at this side of the room. You're all looking at your notebooks. So do get the thinking caps on there. So there are two at the back here now, please.
Hello. You say about, like, the last point about, like, people responding to taxes. Are you, like, implying that decreasing the top rate would increase, like, tax income? And where do your morals lie on that?
So no, on the factual question, no, I'm definitely not suggesting that. I'm not making a statement about the Laffer curve and about where we're at on that. In fact, we could, you know, I think it depends on where you put it. I think we could put tax rates up a little bit and get some more money. The point there about responses is that, you know, if you told me that you wanted to raise a lot more from the top 1%, then my advice would be, that's fine, but you should know that if you put the top rates of income tax up, these people are going to set up their own companies, they're going to put money into pensions, and if you're cool with that, that's fine. But if you really want to get money out of them, maybe you want to look at those other parts of the system to sort of sort those out first, because if you sorted those out, then people wouldn't be able to switch into that form. So you can still do it, but it's just not very effective. Like in the case of the Beatles, if what the government was trying to do was get money out of the Beatles, they failed. So you can do it anyway, but you might have better ways to do it. On the moral question, I said, I'm not here to tell you my morals. I think you have to make your judgments about fairness. I think, it is true that some people would say that we should put up top rates of tax even if we lose money, because they would rather see, the top worse off relative to everybody else and narrow the gap, rather than have the gap, bigger. That's that's a legitimate way of seeing the world. And what societies are really trying to do is everyone has different views on this, and we're trying to come together and say, what do we think overall? But the economics, what we're doing is saying, if you do this, what's going to happen? And what I'm saying is that if you put up top rates of tax in the UK, in fact, the Labour Party earlier this year had a proposal to put up top rates of income tax for high earners. And we said that firstly, how much you actually raise is very uncertain, because these guys have a lot of money, they pay great accountants, it's hard to know exactly what they do. We do know they respond very sharply to taxes, because we have evidence of previous policy reforms where we've seen them respond. And we said that you probably would raise some money, but maybe not as much as you would think, because they'll do these responses. So that's really what we're saying.
I think there's another one back there. Yes, thanks.
Hello. I'm just interested in what you think the tenability of some sort of kind of globalised international body would be for kind of monitoring taxation in an increasingly globalised world.
I think my view right now is that it's not very likely. So there have been some international moves recently. So for example, the OECD ran a big project, it was called the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, snappily titled. And they were trying to basically club together with countries and say, look, we have a problem with multinationals avoiding tax, let's get together and try to write some of our rules to remove the gaps between the rules. Now, that was a massive project. Huge numbers of people put huge amounts of effort into it, and it made some tangible steps. It did rewrite some of the rules that meant that companies can't do some of the same things they used to do, so it made tangible steps. But it is really a very long way away from a kind of a global consensus that says something like, let's all club together, all decide how to do corporation tax, and we'll all just do it. Now, the UN, for example, would like to be the body that coordinates that. But one of the problems we have currently is that whenever you do that kind of system, some countries will win and some countries will lose, meaning that some will get more revenue and some will get less revenue. The European Union for a long time has been trying to have a coordinated corporation tax, and they failed because some countries would lose quite a lot of revenue. And even if those countries think in principle it's a good idea to have this coordinated approach, when you put the number on the table and say, well, you're going to be losing this many billions, you'll lose this many billions, and this person will get this many billions, it turns out politicians don't vote for it. So I think instead what we need to probably do is think, if we can move towards global coordination, then good. And again, there are some examples. Another example which touched on the earlier question was that there are moves to try and get registers of owners of trusts to try, or have secrecy, to remove secrecy agreements between tax authorities, and that might all help. So I think keeping pushing on the international agreement stuff is great, but I don't think we should rely on it happening anytime soon, because it's just so hard to get all those politicians to agree on one single system.
So Thomas Piketty's idea of a wealth tax globally, you think, is a non-starter?
I can't see it happening anytime soon. I think if the European Union can't coordinate a common corporation tax base, I find it hard to imagine how all these countries are going to coordinate. Partly because this is the problem, once you have this tax, who gets the revenue? And until you've got, countries are going to argue about who should get the revenue, and I think that's what makes it difficult. So I think it's a worthy goal in many ways, but I think it's hard to see it happening, in my opinion.
A question here in the middle, please.
I think at the beginning of your speech, you mentioned about 72, people, they think rich people, they pay quite a lot. I think we all know pay a lot, maybe the rich and poor people, the gap is quite a lot. And then the government decided and the poor people pay less. And then what is the potential problem if the poor people, they pay less for the tax?
So is your question, what's the problem with poor people paying less in tax?
Yeah, what is the potential problem or something, people if they pay quite less of the poor people?
Well, I mean, in many ways, it's not a problem. We've long chosen to have a system that takes more from the rich and makes the poor pay less because we want to have a lower burden on the poor. I mean, one thing I will highlight that might be what you're thinking about is that we've had a move recently to take more and more people out of income tax. Now, that's great for people who aren't paying income tax, but it actually also benefits a lot of those moves to take people out of income tax and to increase the point at which you start paying, benefits everybody else who's paying income tax because they also get a tax break at the bottom. So it means that it takes quite a chunk off of our tax base. It's quite expensive to do those kinds of moves, and it helps people at the bottom, but it makes our revenues more concentrated at the top and makes them riskier.
One from the side over here. I'm still looking over at this side.
We're hopeful, right side. You can come through.
Referring to the pie in your presentation, gross domestic product. We know that gross domestic product is a flawed indicator of happiness. A lot of studies have shown this, a lot of top economists. So do you think we need to make a change to, I'd say, the main objective of society, which is gross domestic product, before we make any changes, like real changes to taxes? I know it's a bit of a wide question.
No, that's great. So what I would say is, actually, a lot of what economics does when it's designing tax policies is not, if you think about what economists are trying to maximise, actually, it's not money, it is welfare. So, without wanting to get too technical, a lot of what economics is about is writing down the social welfare function, which is basically what that's trying to do is say, you all have different preferences about what's fair and what's not fair, but we have to come together and say, okay, we're actually going to do something. So it's about thinking about what are those preferences, and we're trying to measure welfare in a broader sense than just money. But you're completely right that the way the metrics we use are based on GDP, and we know that GDP doesn't mean happiness. We haven't got any great measures of happiness, and the countries that have tried haven't come up with great measures of, we can just maximise this instead. A lot of what economists think about actually is how you translate policies that affect taxes into happiness. And in some ways, we know that more money is one way you get happier. So I don't think we need to sort of throw out tax policy until we've found a way to measure happiness. I think what we need to do is just bear in mind when we're thinking about the size of the pie that it's not all that matters, which comes up to discussion earlier. There'll be some people who would accept a smaller size pie if it was more fairly distributed, and that's fine. So it's not about saying we always want to maximise the pie. We don't necessarily. It's just about saying we shouldn't just forget that. We shouldn't just think about the slices and not the size of the pie, because those two things are dependent. So I think we can carry on designing taxes even if we can't measure exactly, gross national happiness.
Finally, thank you.
Okay, I'm just wondering, do you think it would make sense to make a radical cut and say, let's get rid of the income tax altogether and move towards the consumption tax?
So you can find plenty of economics textbooks that would say something good about that. So it would be simple. The thing to know about that is that the reason we have an income tax is to create a progressive tax system. So if we had a consumption tax, then everyone pays a 20% VAT when they go and buy their chocolate biscuits. So it's hard to use a VAT in order to get more from the rich and less from the poor. The way we do that currently, the main tool we use to do that is through an income tax system. So I think all the time we want to carry on having a progressive system that takes more from the rich than they do for the poor, I think we're going to stick with income tax for now. So I don't think we'll be scrapping anytime soon.
I'd like to follow up actually by asking, you made this point about people's views of tobacco taxation. There are more taxes that are actually directly about affecting people's behaviour, sugar taxes and alcohol taxes and so on. So there's kind of different aims that taxes can try to achieve.
No, you're completely right, absolutely. And cigarette taxes is one of those. So one of the reasons the government has cigarette taxes is because it wants to try to discourage people from smoking. And there the case it's not just about taking the rich and giving to the poor or sharing out the pie. It's about trying to affect people's behaviours. What I say about that is that the government does do that. I think there needs to be a pretty high bar before the government starts doing that kinds of things. You can easily get those things wrong, and you can start, fiddling with the taxman, trying to affect people's behaviours and think that you know best, and actually end up, getting it wrong and make people not change their behaviour or change behaviour in ways you didn't want. But there are a bunch of taxes that we do for exactly that reason.
We're in the last few minutes, so one here, and then one in the middle, and then one at the front, and that'll be the last three. I'll just wait for the microphone, thanks.
My question relates to a question asked earlier about international coordinated effort. I know we've got a lot of double taxation agreements with foreign governments, but they're all historical, most of them. And in my line of work, when we ask for information from other countries, they normally don't play ball. So what can you tell me or tell us about the recent efforts that have been done in this area? Because if you see the dual taxation agreements, they're mostly in 60s and 70s that they were signed. And in the modern world today, the needs have changed, the demands of the taxation authorities in the country have changed.
Yeah, so that's an area actually where there's been lots of policy movement right now, recently. So currently, you're right, that when governments want to have an agreement with another country, they have these bilateral, we agree with France, we agree with Switzerland, we agree about specific things. What's happened under this OECD BEPS project that I mentioned earlier is an explicit move towards what they're calling the multilateral instrument, nice and snappy, which is basically just trying to say, let's get beyond this bilateral agreements and set out a framework that says, how are we going to change tax treaties, not one at a time, but for all of our bloc. So that's not quite up off the ground yet, but policymakers all over the OECD have been pouring lots of time into trying to make that work. I mean, it's hard because, like I said, it's back to this issue about governments like the idea of coordinating, they also want what's best for them. So you have to find a way that they can get what they want, but there is a move to try to make a more coherent set of that.
And the one in the middle there, thank you.
Thank you. My question is based on your 30, which is that remember people respond to taxes. Now, obviously we do know in behavioral economics that people respond differently, and everyone in the UK knows if there is a change in the tax policy, the rich respond differently, the poor respond differently, and maybe people in the middle respond differently as well. So probably is it time that we decentralize the taxing system or the policy so that local authorities can decide which policies are fit for their locality, so that if local authorities in those rich areas think they can tax the rich more and they can preempt the type of responses they can get, then obviously it means they will be prepared for the response they get from the rich people, and then the poor local authorities can do the same as well.
Yeah, I think it's two parts to that question. So the first is, the good news is that I think some of the most exciting academic research going on right now is actually to look at exactly what you're saying and taking seriously that different people respond in different ways. So for example, at IFS, we have access to all of your tax records, and we're looking not at on average, how do you respond? We're looking at how particular types of people respond in particular types of ways. So in academia, actually right now, it's an exciting time to be thinking about tax because we're developing the tools and data that allow us to get at that. The second question is about, basically, should we devolve more taxes? Actually, in recent years, we have been devolving more taxes, especially if you think about Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. The basic answer to that is there's a trade-off. So if you give more tax raising or setting powers to a local area, that can be great for the reasons that you were setting out, that they have more control over what they're going to do. But it can also lead to disparities between places. So for example, London has really quite a lot of high earners, and somewhere in the northeast has fewer of them. So if you let the northeast go off and do its own thing, what if it then gets poorer and can't raise enough revenue? Are you going to just leave it alone and have that disparity grow between London and the northeast? So there's a trade-off between, on the one hand, wanting to have regional autonomy and let them do their own things, but also wanting to have some redistribution across the country. So there's a trade-off. We are moving towards more devolution. I think that'll be a trend we carry on seeing, but we'll have to be careful about these trade-offs.
And the final question.
Thank you. There's been quite a lot of interesting discussion recently about the idea of a universal basic income, the idea that everybody should get a basic amount and then the tax system applies after that. Do you think it's a good idea? And if you do you think it could work?
Great question, Heather. So I think the first thing I'm saying is I think people have in mind different things when they think about universal basic income, but just taking this idea that we give everyone a large lump of cash. I think the thing to say about that is, in order to give people enough money that it was meaningful, not just £1,000, but enough that actually it could be a meaningful chunk that you could really live on, that would be extraordinarily expensive, and we'd still have to raise the money. So if you think about, we give everyone these money, we need to raise the money. We probably want to raise more of it from rich people, so you're going to give them all this money and then take it away from them again. So I can't see anytime soon we're going to have a universal basic income that's big enough that we're talking about people can actually just sit back and not work on this, because we'd have to raise the money and it's just super expensive. More broadly, you can think of universal income really as just another way of talking about the benefit system. We want to give, we want to help some people. We could try to help all people, or we could try to target it at people that we think need the most help. So my guess is that we'll carry on doing something that looks more like we'll target it at people that needs more help. So I don't think we're around the corner of universal basic income, and I think it would be very expensive.
Helen, it's been an amazing tour de force. Frivolously, I quite like the idea of a special high tax rate for the pop groups I don't like, so I can get them to leave the country. But it's been amazing. Thank you for answering all the questions. Thank you for your talk. Please can you join me in